Hi and welcome to my talk. In this talk I am going to say a few things about the briefing that you've been set for the Extinction Rebellion ESI Schools Day, and also give you some background on the strategy, the action, the activists who are part of EXAR, and also some points of critique around Extinction Rebellion as well. In addition to this video, I'm also going to make available to you another video that I have produced for my undergraduate students who are studying participating in politics, which is there just to remind you of the value of protest. I think we live in a current climate where the government is seeming to want to clamp down on protest. Now, some of the reasons for that are obvious, given that we have a pandemic and that we're required to do social distancing in order to prevent the spread of COVID. But some commentators are concerned that this represents the twilight for democracy as we know it. So I've put a video in about the role of protest in democracy historically, just to put the current context into a broader context for you. So what will I do today? Well, I shall introduce who I am. I'll say something about the brief that you've been set. I'll give you a brief history of climate change protest, because Extinction Rebellion is part of a long-term tendency for citizens to engage in protest against climate change. I'll introduce you to what Extinction Rebellion is and its strategies. I'll show you some photographs of some of the things that Extinction Rebellion has been doing. Then I'll turn to some disparaging things that the newspapers have said about Extinction Rebellion and compare that to some profiling of Extinction Rebellion activists that I've done myself with some colleagues based on protest survey data. I'll then say a bit more about critique and contention and put this in the context also of anti-terrorism legislation and the recent policing bill that's about to be debated in Parliament, and which is thought to be having serious implications for the future of our freedom to speak out and our freedom to protest. And then some concluding thoughts for you. So first off, who am I? My name's Professor Clare Saunders. I'm what we might call an expert in environmental politics. I've written the book you can see a picture of there, called Environmental Networks and Social Movement Theory. That was published in 2013. It's now quite old, but a lot of the examples in that book of activism are based around attempts to try to stop runaway climate change. I'm also the co-author of a really well-selling textbook called Environmental Politics in Theory and Practice, published by Routledge. Now, you might be able to see me, see the little video of me, and you'll be able to tell that I'm a sympathetic academic, but my dreads belie who I really am. I might look like I'm an activist, but the reality of it is that when one is an academic, one usually doesn't have that much time to be an activist as well. And I'm also quite pragmatic and quite careful, and actually quite reluctant to break the law, although I do have some sympathy for people who do so, because I think climate change is an incredibly serious concern, and the costs of not acting outweigh the costs of acting for certain people. Okay, so let me first say about your ESI schools brief. There is also a document available which has exactly this text on it, and also a few more tips as well. You are asked to produce either a 1,000 word report or a 3 to 5 minute video that you will upload to the place described and the general information about the ESI Schools Day. In your report or video, you have a brief to address, which requires you answering 4 questions. Before you answer these questions, you have to do a bit of imagining. I'd like you to imagine that you're part of an Extinction Rebellion schools group and that there aren't any COVID restrictions. And I'd like you to imagine that you're going to propose an action for the group to engage in order to raise the profile of climate change. In your report or your video, I would like you to firstly describe what your action is. Secondly, to think about the types of people who you would wish to engage in your action, and to think about what it is that they will do. Thirdly, think about who or what the action will target. Is it aimed at the general public? Is it aimed at a particularly environmentally damaging sector of the economy? Is it targeting a particular company? Is it targeting the government? And why have you chosen that particular target? And then I think probably the most important part of this is to have a think about what some of the reactions might be if this proposed action was to go ahead. I want you to think about positive and negative reactions to it, and this is really important given that there's currently, as I mentioned at the start of my talk, somewhat of an anti-protesting ethos amongst the government at present. Okay, so before I talk too much about Extinction Rebellion, let me just say a few things about climate change protest. So it's been going on for over 20 years, and I've just listed on this slide some of the significant demonstrations that have happened in that time period. So we could begin in the early noughties with international actions at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change conferences of the parties. On this slide, shortened to UNFCCC COPS. Friends of the Earth was engaged in one of these, and it built an artificial dike around the conference centre to draw attention to climate change and flooding issues. National climate change marches organised by a Campaign Against Climate Change, and later on by a coalition called Stop Climate Change, which was a coalition of over 100 different aid, trade, development organisations and environmental organisations coming together, organising national climate marches that coincided with the UNFCCC COPs, usually in London, and usually a march from point A to point B, oftentimes ending somewhere near Parliament Square. One of the first environmental direct action groups to emerge was Rising Tide, which tried to stage actions to actually put themselves or their bodies in the way of environmental damage. So they were pioneers, for example, of protests against BP being sponsors of the Tate Gallery. These protests carried on over the decades, and I think now the Tate Gallery no longer takes sponsorship from BP, but it took years of protest for that decision to be made. In the mid-2000s, this kind of sort of like direct action focus was sort of superseded by a practical on-the-grounds movement called Transition Towns, which laid out a roadmap for communities to work together to try to move them beyond current ways of doing things. It was motivated by a suggestion that we were reaching peak oil, and also by the fact that climate change needs to be addressed. And people were doing things like creating new currencies to localise themselves. They were setting up new local farmers markets, promoting local food, promoting bicycles and public transport, just basically sustainabilise the way that we were running our communities. In the late 2000s, a new wave of climate action emerged called the Camps for Climate Action. These were camps that took place on land that was squatted close to environmental pariahs, let's say, companies that were producing disproportionate amounts of greenhouse gases, in other words. So in 2007, there was a camp outside of Heathrow Airport against the proposals for a third runway, and in 2008 the camp was in the vicinity of Kingsnorth Power Station, which the government at the time had put forward for the generation of a new coal-fired power station, with the plan of eventually transitioning it over to carbon capture and storage. The activists argued that carbon capture and storage was 30 years ahead in the future, and it was therefore folly to build a new coal-fired power station. In the mid-2010s, there emerged movements against fracking through Reclaim the Power, and these kinds of movements were often fairly localised and tried to shut down operations for the exploration for shale gas. In the late 2010s, we've started to see the emergence of actions we're now more familiar with, so Fridays for the Future and the global climate strike, led by Greta Thunberg, who first started taking Fridays off school and positioning herself outside the Swedish Parliament, and then that spread, and we've had a few global days of climate striking and also Extinction Rebellion. And ongoing throughout all of this has been probably one of the stalwart climate change campaigning organisations, the Campaign Against Climate Change. I just wanted to show you some pictures of some campaign strategies. That these are not Extinction Rebellion, these are sort of like preceding Extinction Rebellion, but do use some of the strategies that you will also see Extinction Rebellion using. So you can see there, top left, that looks like a climate march. Next to it, boycotting a Shell power station. The one next to that is an action in the Tate Gallery against the sponsorship that I mentioned, BP sponsoring Tate Gallery. You can see there's a significant climate march there. If you see the one on the right, it says Gordon. That's Kingsnorth coal-fired power station, where 8 Greenpeace activists scaled the tower and were going to graffiti on it, Gordon bin it. That was a message to Gordon Brown, who was then at the time Prime Minister. And this was a landmark case because the company, E.ON, got taken to... the company took the Greenpeace activists to court, wanting to fine them for criminal damage, but Greenpeace got together some very important witnesses to talk about how serious climate change is, including James Hansen, who was one of the first people in the 80s to note the significance of climate change as a problem. And the activists actually won the case. They were not fined for criminal damage because the jury and the judge argued that the costs of their pollution were actually less damaging than the effect of clearing it up. So basically, I've got that wrong. Basically, they were saying that the costs of climate change were significantly exceeding the cost of damage to the power station. There's also some other things on here. I think you can see second row down, second one in from the left, that's Friends of the Earth and the Big Ask campaign. They basically got lots of people in their local groups network to get citizens to sign up for the Climate Change Act, which is now instituted in law, which at the time was going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2050 on 1990 levels. Those targets have now been increased to try to be climate neutral by that point in time. The picture bang in the middle there that says Our Climate, Our Land is from Greenpeace, and Greenpeace there basically bought a piece of land where the new third runway was going to go, and then they sold off 1 metre squared patches of it, so that if this runway does go ahead, it becomes really difficult for Greenpeace to sell the land to get rights, because loads of different people own the land. It just puts a spanner in the works, basically. What else can you see? There's another clip from the Big Ask campaign. You can see cycling. Bottom right there is the Heathrow climate camp. You can also see there's some blockading here. Bottom left, that's Gordon Brown, who was the Prime Minister in 2008, and the fella there is a chap called Dan Glass, who was being presented by Gordon Brown with an award for his services to environmental activism, and he actually very cheekily put superglue in his hand and superglued himself to the sleeve of Gordon Brown's rather nice suit jacket in order to raise attention to the fact that the government wasn't doing enough to help address climate change. Let's fast forward then to Extinction Rebellion. What is Extinction Rebellion? There's a little book that one could get, a handbook called This Is Not a Drill. Obviously I am not really allowed to advocate this to you because I think the government might consider this to be a terrorist organisation in some ways, but it's a call to rebellion that recognises the 6th mass extinction that it says we're currently going through. Extinction Rebellion is calling for the truth about the scientific consensus of climate change to be widely recognised and revealed to the people. It's also calling for the security and well-being of people and the planet, and it believes that citizens have a sacred duty to rebel against inadequate laws. It demands informed solutions to problems. To just quote one sentence from this book, it says, "We act in peace with ferocious love of these lands in our hearts." XR has had 3 demands. The first one, tell the truth. The second one, to act now, suggesting that the government must act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. And thirdly, its third demand is to move beyond politics suggesting that the government must create and be led by the decisions of a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. What then is Extinction Rebellion's action repertoire? Basically, it works on a model of civil resistance, arguing that we only need 3.5% of the population to engage in disruptive action in order to bring a significant change into the way we run our social, political and economic life. So the idea has been really to try to get high numbers of activists to coalesce on capital cities, to engage in non-violent law breaking, to make this fun, and as part of this to actively seek arrest, with the idea that doing this can draw attention to the need to address climate change urgently. Having said that, that makes it sound like it's quite a prescriptive model. There are prescriptions, there are guidelines on how Extinction Rebellion groups can run, but local groups can also be fairly diverse and flexible in working out their own ways of doing things. The emphasis then is on a combination of disruption, outreach and visioning, including deliberative decision making. Here are some pictures of some of the things that Extinction Rebellion has done. Some of them a lot more conflictual than others. I've picked out a few Cornish examples where I can, so you might see on there somewhere the heliport, Penzance heliport climate crime scene, and you can see that the protesters there are trying to be COVID aware, and they've even got a placard bottom left saying COVID aware protesting. You see there's some symbolic action. I think this is from Extinction Rebellion Cornwall, with the Extinction Rebellion activists on a boat. The next one along, I understand, is DEFRA, the offices of DEFRA, that's the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, being temporarily closed down by climate activists calling for a recognition of the need for a declaration of climate emergency. So here they will have superglued themselves onto the doors of the office. You can see in the middle row on the left, that looks like the police talking to some Extinction Rebellion protesters who've blockaded the street. The next one along, you can see women in white dresses with fake blood down them. These are Extinction Rebellion activists suggesting that we should put the planet before fashion, which is also represented in the die-in in the next picture along. Then you can see at the bottom, second one in, that's an example of some Extinction Rebellion cyclists basically, drawing attention to the fact that cycling is much more carbon neutral than driving. Then we have the buckets of blood action, which obviously did cause severe nuisance but also raised attention, so you might want to have a critical think about that type of action. Very good at raising awareness, much worse in terms of causing significant public nuisance and also costs in order to clear it up. And then I just included a picture bottom right there of an elderly Extinction Rebellion member being arrested. So it's important, I think, to recognise that this isn't just young people causing a nuisance. Actually, Extinction Rebellion represents a broad cross-section of the public. I want to think briefly about what's new. So I've talked about the repertoires from other climate action, and you can probably see some similarities, but I think one of the things that's new is that you have for the first time here quite ordinary people engaging with radical action. And I'm quoted here by Leonardo da Vinci saying that it's unique and that I can't think of any protest movement historically happening in this way. Usually when we think about direct action climate activists, we're thinking about people who belong to radical subcultures and are idealistic. Extinction Rebellion has managed to reach out a little bit beyond the usual suspects. But of course, Extinction Rebellion is not universally popular. It's been slammed in the news. Apparently, I think this was actually in 2019, Extinction Rebellion managed to get 2.5 million in funding, and in the media there are some criticisms of that possibly coming from dubious sources. And then there's a similar criticism about how some of its activists are actually quite rich but have been claiming expenses from that fund, including a baronet's daughter. Gail Bradbrook, one of the founder members of Extinction Rebellion, is recorded to have had a personal mission of social change revealed to her after taking ayahuasca, which is a Peruvian rite of passage drug, and some people are critical of that. Extinction Rebellion has also been accused of not paying tax. Campaigners are seen as being holier than thou. In some cases they've caused significant disruption. I heard for myself when I was observing the 2019 October Extinction Rebellion protest that people were getting frustrated by the roads being closed and shouting at the protesters and the police, open the roads, and also shouting at the protesters to get a job. And they're called climate whingers by some. It's also seen to be very expensive. So the October fortnight of action in 2019 actually cost the government £37 million, the cost of which arguably could be spent directly on dealing with climate change. Activists in the April 2019 action disrupted the tube, and there was a lot of debate about whether that was a stupid thing to do or not, because the tube is actually more environmentally friendly than some alternative ways. And Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, called Extinction Rebellion activists, quite famously he called them crusties who live in hemp-smelling bivouacs. Now, is this true? So basically I did 2 surveys of Extinction Rebellion in April 2019 and October 2019, using some protocols for catching people in the act of protest, which allow us to be able to work out whether there's response rate bias or not. I've since calculated response rate bias and found it not to be a significant problem with this data. So what do we know then about Extinction Rebellion activists? You can see that around a quarter of them are freelance or self-employed. A whopping 17% of them are retired, which is almost as many of them who are in full-time work. There certainly don't seem to be layabouts doing nothing. Only 4.4% of them are unemployed. We asked them to self-identify what their class was. You can see that they mostly conceive of themselves as they mostly conceive of themselves as lower middle class or upper middle class. Few of them consider themselves to be working class or upper class. Few of them don't actually know how they identify. We also find more women than we do men, and a range of ages, the youngest being 10, the oldest 77, with a mean of 45.8 years. Why do people protest? We ask them to write down in a few words. They say they protest to save the planet. They say they want to take responsibility for their generation and future generations. A number of them mentioned that they wanted to stop a catastrophe, or they were mentioning the need for urgency or emergency. A couple of quotes here then. One of our respondents said, "Climate change poses an existential threat and it worries me." And somebody else went so far as to say, "Because if I don't, I will have blood on my hands." How do they think that problems can be solved? We asked them the extent to which they disagree or agree with the following statements. So we asked them if modern science can be relied on to solve environmental problems. You see that similar amounts of people agree and disagree, although slightly more disagreeing than agreeing. When we ask them about whether governments can solve our environmental problems, you see they are much more disparaging of the role of governments, which is ironic in a way, because Extinction Rebellion actions are trying to target the government to make change, even though they don't believe governments can be relied on to solve problems. Can we achieve this primarily through voluntary lifestyle changes? Extinction Rebellion activists say no, and the government must act on what climate scientists say, even if the majority of people are opposed. They strongly agree with this statement, so actually they are proposing that we are less democratic if that means saving the planet. What's their previous participation in protests? We've reported this, saying that we think they are relative novices. If you have a look protest participation ever. More than half of them have done it 5 times or fewer. When we look at protest participation in the last 12 months, we see that only a very small percentage have been working on 11 or more demos in their lifetime. So that gives us an idea of who they are. What do people say about Extinction Rebellion? Well, there are some conspiracists who think that there's somehow a link between 5G mobile phone technology and Extinction Rebellion, simply because Gail Bradbrook used to work in the telecommunications industry. There's also some critique saying the police should take a more active role in clearing the protests so that the protests don't continue to disrupt people's lives. There's a point of critique which says, well, why don't they do something more useful than disrupting people's lives in London? Why don't they actually try to directly disrupt the fossil fuel industry? Some people are critical of the notion of citizens' assemblies, wondering how this might actually work in practice when climate change is one of many issues that governments have to grapple. There's also some criticisms, and I know Extinction Rebellion is working really hard on this, but there are some criticisms of Extinction Rebellion's failure to attract ethnic minorities. Our own observations suggest that most activists are indeed white, and this could be partly due to Black, Asian, minority ethnic people being unwilling to engage in this strategy of willing arrest when they are already picked on by police officers disproportionately for having done nothing wrong. There's also seemed to be some misappropriation of the social science of movements fighting for ethnic minority rights and also for democratisation. So this idea that if you get 3.5% of the population to engage in civil disobedience, you can have a regime change, that comes from a particular study about democratisation movements within a particular type of political context, which some people argue doesn't apply to Western democratised countries. And I think we also need to think seriously about Extinction Rebellion in relation to terrorism. Terrorism is defined by the Crown Prosecution Service as the use or threat of action both in and outside of the UK designed to influence any international government organisation or to intimidate the public. It must also be for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial or ideological cause. Extinction Rebellion, along with Global Climate Strike, is on a prescribed list of organisations that is deemed to be ideological and seen to be at risk of converting people to terrorism. So here's an extract of a document from the Prevent Duty, which is a legal obligation on organisations, teaching organisations, universities, schools, colleges, etc., who makes it clear to us people who are teaching that Extinction Rebellion is a campaign that encourages protest and civil disobedience to put pressure on governments to take action on climate change and species extinction. And they are seen to be a threat because they have an anti-establishment philosophy that wants to change the system, and that trying to attract school-age children to this cause is not appropriate because the campaign encourages law-breaking activities. So when you are doing your own brief, I would like to very, very strongly encourage you to make sure that you are not proposing overtly law-breaking actions, or if you do so, to ensure that they are very well measured. Let's put this in the context of some more recent stuff that you may have heard about on the news. You may have heard about scuffles between protest and police officers in Bristol, where protesters were campaigning against the police crime sentencing and court bill that's currently about to be debated in Parliament. This is known as the Policing Bill for short, and it basically gives the police extended powers to clamp down on protest. Basically, any protest that's deemed a public nuisance can be broken up by police. There are going to be tighter restrictions on the length of protest and on the noise levels coming from protest. And police will no longer have to give a warning that protesters are causing an offence. Protesters should know. When I went to the October 2019 Extinction Rebellion event to observe and to conduct a survey of who was there, I noticed that police officers were giving what were called Section 31 orders. I think that's what they were called. And they were basically saying, if you don't clear this bridge now, you may be arrested. So people had an indication of when they were breaking the law, and they could in that way avoid arrest should they want to, although obviously some people were willingly accepting arrest. And that will no longer happen, that warning. And protesters could get up to 10 years in prison for something like damaging a memorial, which is more years in prison than what some rapists get. So there's a lot of critique around this, with human rights campaigners and pro-democracy campaigners arguing that this steps beyond the bounds of what's acceptable in a democracy. So some concluding thoughts then. You can appreciate from this talk that Extinction Rebellion draws quite heavily on existing protest repertoires, but hopefully you've learnt that it's novel in terms of the numbers of relatively ordinary people taking to the streets. I don't think that Extinction Rebellion is a movement of crusties who live in hemp-smelling bivouacs. It's been hugely successful at raising the profile of climate change, but also arguably successful at drawing drawing the government's attention to protest and giving the government new grounds for trying to clamp down on protests. I'm going to make available for you a link to the government website that introduces the policing bill, so that you can see in there the government's actually saying that movements like Extinction Rebellion have revealed loopholes in the protesting of policing. So yes, we're seeing the state and police adapting to clamp down on disruptive Extinction Rebellion actions. We note that the protesters are themselves a mixed bunch, many of them relative novices, and they're from all ages and from many talks and walks of life. They're certainly not merely crusty idols, and I think we see many worthy everyday folk amongst them. So that's it for my talk. I encourage you to listen to it more than once, and also to follow the links that I've made available for you, and my other video that I've produced on the importance of protest in shaping democracies. Thanks for listening.